Hi there, I'm Jeff.
And I'm Ilya.
And we're working on a project where we're hacking up some RC cars and making them programmable.
Yes.
We've been putting Raspberry Pis on them and motor controllers, and we can program them to do all kinds of things for all kinds of projects. Do you want me to tell them about the basic version first?
Yeah.
Okay.
Sure.
So this started with a cheap RC car. We're going to show you what that looks like in a few minutes. And all I did was install, this is a Raspberry Pi Zero, right? These cost $5 or $10. And this is a motor controller, which lets the Pi talk to the motors. And I reused the built-in battery box. So this is sort of like the really simple example of roboticizing an RC car, right? No frills. What do you got going on in yours?
And this is like the frills version.
You've definitely added some stuff compared to my
Yes.
version, right? What do you got for extra parts on?
So for extra parts, for one, he's just using like AA's. I'm using this LiPo.
Way more powerful.
Yeah. And I have a Raspberry Pi 4 instead of a Pi 0 because I'm running like a lot of things off this, and it's way faster. That makes life a lot easier. And I have a camera, which I can get a live video feed from.
Awesome.
I have an ultrasonic sensor, which I can sense distance from.
Okay.
And the motors are a bit overvolted, so they go faster than that.
Okay. So definitely overpowered compared to mine,
Yes.
right? But it sort of shows the point where you can like do the basic build, right? But you can also mod it out and add all kinds of stuff depending on what you want to do.
This started out as something like that.
Cool. Yeah, that's awesome. All right, so why don't we start from the beginning, and we'll show what it looks like going through the process of taking a cheap RC car and not motorizing it, making it programmable. You know. Yeah. All right. So what are the parts that we need to do this project?
Okay, so parts. So we need a cheap RC car.
Yep.
Some jumper wires.
Yep. Do you know what the fancy term for those is?
Something that starts with a D.
Yes, they're called DuPont wires. And so sometimes they have these, or DuPont wires always have these little push connectors on the end. So these ones are female, they go into pins. There's other ones that have pins coming out of them, but we're going to use the female kind today.
We're also going to need this little motor driver
Yep.
that we got from like Adafruit or Amazon or somewhere.
Yep.
And a Raspberry Pi Zero W.
Okay.
It's important that you get the W version because otherwise you won't be able to like connect to it wirelessly.
Yep. What about these?
These wire strippers and pliers. What are you going to use pliers for?
Actually, probably wire cutters would be better. You want to grab the wire cutters?
Wire cutters.
Nice. And then part of this project you're going to need to do a little bit of soldering with, right?
Soldering iron.
Right. So any old soldering iron and regular old solder is going to do. If you haven't soldered before, there's plenty of good resources online. We'll link to one or two good videos on how to solder. There's, or we might even put one up on our channel. But if you have these things, you should be great to go for this project.
Okay, so we have this $5 RC car that we got from Five Below. You can buy them anywhere that sells cheap stuff.
Yeah, I think Five Below is in like the whole country, but you can get similar stuff on Amazon.
Your Walmart.
Yeah, eBay probably.
Yeah.
Okay.
Who buys like cheap toys off of eBay?
Well, I guess I don't really know the question. I mean the answer to that question, but you probably pay a lot in shipping.
Yeah. Okay. So it's just these tabs that unscrew hopefully. It also comes with a remote, but we won't be needing the remote.
And you know this is serious because it's got teeth.
Yeah, it has teeth.
Right? Don't want to mess with that thing.
So it has these three little quick release tabs. I don't know if you can see them. Other cars might be different. But it's pretty simple to take the top off.
I think on mine it had screws that held the shell on.
Yeah.
But that's not a big deal.
It's fine if you break those. Probably not going to be putting the top on. Because whenever I'm taking these apart, I break like 2 out of the 3 things that are securing it.
Okay, so we're probably done with that.
Yeah, so it looks like this. There's more stuff under it.
I'm going to take those screws off and we'll get a look
For
inside.
this car, we've had experience. This part, if you have this exact same car, these 2 screws there, those 3, don't unscrew those because that unscrews the steering assembly, and we don't want to take apart the steering.
Sure. if you do accidentally take that apart, it's certainly possible to get it back together. But in a lot of these, you don't have to take the part that holds the steering out. You're really just trying to get at the electronics so we can wire the Pi in the motor controller into the motors of the car. Do you need a longer screwdriver, or are you okay?
I think that might be good.
Okay. I'll grab one just in case. This one I think is a little bit bigger.
Okay.
Like, I don't know if that's going to get a grip.
I think that one's.
Nice.
It has a little antenna wire.
You can just take the tape off and it'll slide right through.
I can take the tape off.
Nice. Okay, so you can see on the controller board here, we've got the wires coming in from the drive motor, and we've got the wires coming in, I guess that's the drive motor. We've got the wires coming in from the steering motor, okay? And then we've also got the wires coming in from the battery box. We're going to cut all of those, and we're going to remove the controller entirely. All of those wires, the power and the two motors, those are going to go to our electronics, our Raspberry Pi and our motor.
Wrong things. Oh, right things.
Yeah, there you go.
Just got wires, snippers. But you can try to cut the things close to the board so I have the maximum wire length.
Yep. Cool. And then I think you got one more. All right. So in this case, we've got a power switch. So we're going to try to save that. That's just going to make it easy to turn the thing on and off. And then we've got the two wires here for the steering motor, and we've got the two wires back here that are going to make the car go forward, right? So we're going to use all of those.
Yep.
So where do we want to start? Do we want to put the motor controller on first? Does that make sense?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So this motor controller, really cheap. This will cost you $1 or $2. I think I got a 4 or 5 pack of these for about $6 on Amazon. And this is basically like the thing that goes between the motors and the Pi. The Pi can't run the motors directly. The Pi switches this on and off, and that switches the motors on and off. And that's going to let us control like direction, maybe even speed from code on the Raspberry Pi. So you want to use some double stick tape to attach that?
We're just using this double stick tape to attach the... Oh, one thing. So if you're using double stick tape and the end of your motor controller looks like this, there are pins that are sticking out a bit too much. If you just cut off the tops of those...
If you use your index finger over the thing while you're cutting it, then it doesn't send the part flying.
You can just do that.
You can do that.
And it still sends it flying.
You just want to get in your eyes.
Just cut those off with like some wire cutters, and then that will eliminate your problem of the double stick tape.
Nice and flat.
Yeah,
cool.
Flat.
Right.
Having two.
So if this is the steering, you think maybe right there? Yeah, because you still get pins under that thing, so you can hang that off the edge a little bit.
That's good.
Yeah, that looks good.
There you go.
Right. So we got our motor controller stuck down right in place right there. Okay, so maybe we should find a place for the Raspberry Pi while we're at it.
Yeah.
So we have the Raspberry Pi, and I mentioned before, in this build we're using a Pi 0W, right? So this has, I don't think it's focusing. This has Bluetooth and wireless built in. It's got all the I/O pins we're going to need. And I've got an OS image for this. I'll put a link in the video description. And it's kind of neat. When you boot it up, it gives you a wireless access point that you can connect to. So you don't need to worry about a display and a keyboard and stuff on the Pi. You can just connect to it and then use a web browser to program on the Pi or do whatever you need to do. So I'll share that with you through the video description. Okay, so next step would be to attach the Raspberry Pi.
Okay, so put some double stick tape on the Pi.
Yep.
I'm probably just going to put like another little piece there.
Sure.
So it has a better like seal, stick, bond.
Yep.
I don't know the correct word.
And so if you're putting one of these together out there in internet land, anywhere you can find to locate the Pi that's within reasonable reach of the other wires is totally fine.
Okay, so where do we want to put it?
I would put it right here on the front. I think that's going to be out of the way.
Put the pins this way?
Yeah, I think that's great.
Yeah.
Okay, for this next bit, we got to get like super zoomed in. And if you take a look at the Raspberry Pi on your screen right now, you see these pins along the side. This is where we plug things in. This is where the motor controller hooks up, and this is where the power comes from. On the Raspberry Pi Zero that we're using in this project, pin number 1 is right here. It's the one that's closest to the memory card slot, right? So it's on the inside of the board, and it's down the end where the memory card slot is. Now, on the diagram on the screen, pin number 1 is in the upper left-hand corner. So it sort of makes sense. They sort of line up. And so you need to know where the pin numbers are so that we plug the wires into the right places. So if you take a look at the diagram, you can see pin number 1 is in the upper left. Pin number 2 is to the right of it. Pin number 3 is in the next row on the left-hand side. Pin number 4 is on the right-hand side. And it continues that pattern all the way down to pin number 40. So now we know what the pin numbers are. What are we going to do with them? Well, the picture that I put on your screen right now is a wiring diagram for how all of this stuff gets connected. And it might look like a few wires, especially if you haven't wired something like this up before, but there's really only like 10 of them, 12 of them, and it's not really that complicated. We've got 4 wires going from the Raspberry Pi to the motor controller. Actually, we got 6. 4 of them for data, turning things on and off, and then 2 for power, the red and the black ones. We've got 2 wires going to the battery box, and then we've got 4 wires coming from the motor controller out to the motors. And that's really it. So we're going to go through and hook these things all up in order now so that everything's connected and we can start playing with the car. So the first thing we're going to connect is the wires that go from the motors to the motor controller. So the first step is to loosen the screw terminals if they're not already. And then we can give the wires a little twist to keep all the strands together. And then stick them inside the connectors and snug them down. Now, it's not a big deal if you get these wires reversed. The reason for that is we can make a simple change in the code that will reverse the connections and make the motor run in the proper direction. So for example, if you had planned to hook these up one way so that in code when you tell the motor to go it spins forward, but instead it spins reverse, it's really just a matter of a simple change in the code, or you can loosen these screw terminals and move the wires into the opposite positions. Either one is fine. So at this point, don't worry about getting them in the right spots. If you're not sure which one goes where, you can always adjust that later. Get the second wires installed here, like that. And actually, because this other wire is a little short, let's swap that around. And just to illustrate that, we get another shot from the side. You can see all 4 wires are in there and clamped up nice and tight. Okay. Next, we're going to run the wires that go from the Raspberry Pi input and output pins over to the motor controller. So if you refer back to the diagram we had on the screen a moment ago, the first connection we're going to go is from pin number 3. So as you might remember, we get pin 1 nearest the SD card, 2 on the outside, 3 is the next row on the inside. Pin number 3 goes to this first pin on the motor controller, right there. And then pin number 5, which is right next to it, is the next odd pin. That goes to the next pin over here on the motor controller. Just make sure we're still in focus here. I'll give you a nice clear view. After that, we have pin 11. So we've got 3, 5, 7, 9, pin number 11. And that goes over to the second to last pin on the motor controller here. And then pin 13 is the next pin on that row over here. goes to the last pin on the motor controller. So these are what we will call the logic pins or the signal pins. These are the ones that we're going to turn on and off. We're going to turn output pins on the Pi on and off in code, and that's going to tell the motor controller which motor to turn on and in which direction we want it to go. It's going to make a little more sense once we look at the example code. Okay, now we have a couple more wires that we need to take care of here. We need wires that will power the Pi from the batteries, and we need wires that will power the motor controller from the batteries. In an earlier version of this project, I actually ran the power to the Pi and then power from the Pi to the motor controller, but that actually caused a problem where if the car got stuck and the motor stalled out, it would actually draw so much power from the Pi that it would reboot. So in this version, I'm going to run 2 sets of power wires, one set to the Pi and one set to the motor controller. So let's get those ready. I've got 2 of these jumper wires here. I've cut off the other ends so I can solder them. Let's move this out of the way so you can see what I'm doing. I'm going to strip the ends here, give myself a little bit of extra because I've got to wrap these around the terminals before I solder them. I want to get a nice physical connection before I solder it in place. You can see here I've stripped the ends. I'm going to twist them together, and these are going to be the 2 connections that I need from the positive side of the battery box. So if you take a look back at the car here, the positive power that goes to the Pi and to the motor controller is coming off this switch here. So I'm going to desolder that connection and replace it with these 2 wires. I've got my soldering iron ready to go. It's nice and hot. I'm going to melt a little bit of fresh solder on the end of the iron. It's going to help me to conduct heat onto the solder joint. And if I just heat up that joint a tiny bit, like this, makes the old wire come right off. Then I'm going to wrap the new wires around that joint so that they're held in place, and then I can go back and solder them. It's a little tricky to get down in there. Let's try that again. Get some fresh solder on the iron. Flow that joint. If it pops off, just hold it back on there. And just make sure that these wires are attached. That looks good. So now we've got our 2 positive wires. The first one is going to go onto the motor controller on the pin that's labeled VCC on the labels over here. And the other one is going to go to pin number 4 on the Raspberry Pi. We'll do the same thing over here with the negative battery connection from the batteries. Get our old black wire here. Might be different color on your car. That's fine. We'll heat up that iron again. Get in here, put a little bit of tension on that wire as we heat up this joint. The wire comes right off. Once again, we'll strip these 2 wires we're going to use for the negative side of the battery connection. We'll twist them together. Okay. And then over on the car, I'm going to tuck these wires around this battery terminal. Sometimes you might have to, sorry, let's try not to block the shot here. Get this wire wrapped around this battery terminal. can be a little tricky. Takes a little patience. Get the wires wrapped around like that. That's pretty good. Now we'll get in with a soldering iron, heat up the joint, melt some fresh solder in there, just like that. Now we have a nice solid joint for these two wires. So we'll do these last two connections now. One of the negative power wires is going to go to pin number 6 on the Raspberry Pi. Just right in there. That's pin 2, 4, number 6, the third pin in on the even side of the pin row. Refer back to that wiring diagram if you need it. And then the other connection is going to the pin on the motor controller. It's the only one that's left. It's labeled GND, which is technically not correct. GND is sort of commonly used to refer to the negative battery connection, but it's not really a ground connection, so GND is sort of incorrect. But in any case, you want to run the other negative battery connection here over to the pin on the motor controller labeled GND. All right, so now at this point, you want to double check all of your connections and make sure that everything is going where you think it is, because the next step is going to be to turn the car on for the first time. And we want it to power up and do what we want it to do. We don't want to accidentally damage any parts because we miswired anything. So just to go back over those, we've got pin number 3 on the Raspberry Pi going to the first pin on the motor controller. We've got pin number 5 on the Raspberry Pi going to the second pin on the motor controller. The third pin on the motor controller is one of our positive power connections. The fourth pin on the motor controller is one of the negative power connections. The fifth pin on the motor controller goes to pin number 11 on the Raspberry Pi, and the last pin on the motor controller goes to pin number 13 on the Raspberry Pi. Now, we've also got the 4 connections going from the motors to the output sides of the motor controller. So wire 1 and 2 from the steering motor going to this side of the motor controller, and wires 1 and 2 from the drive motor going to this side of the motor controller. And then lastly, we've got the 2 power connections going to the Raspberry Pi. The first one, this blue wire in my case, is going from the power switch over to pin number 4 on the Raspberry Pi, and then we've got the other negative battery connection going to pin number 6 on the Raspberry Pi. So if everything looks good, we're ready to power it up for the first time.
Okay, so when you're done with everything and the wiring's all good, just flip the car over. It's going to have power switch. Hit that, and a light on the Pi will come on. You might want to wait a couple seconds. And that's light's going to come on, the green light. And the motor controller should also have a red light there.
If you don't see the Pi light, what should you do?
Turn it off.
And then what?
Troubleshoot.
Yeah, exactly. Good deal.
Just like look up my Raspberry Pi isn't showing a light, and you'll find a million solutions. Now I'm going to show you how to get the image for the Raspberry Pi onto your Pi. So first thing there's gonna be an image download link in the video description, so you don't need to worry about that now. So for running the Pi, you could use like a regular Raspbian image, but that's a pain to get all the stuff on. So we created an image that already has everything you need on it and already will broadcast an access point like you saw in the video. So that's going to be much easier to use. So to get that image on, I'm just going to search up Etcher. I'll put a download link in the description. It's a Etcher Bueno. So I'm just going to download from macOS. Open that. It's going to open. So first you just want to put your SD card in. Okay. So that will probably show up, but if it isn't showing up, you can do like change and all. And then you're just going to select your image. Open. And then when you have both of that good, you're just gonna flash, and then that's gonna flash. It might take a while, but it doesn't really matter. When it's done etching, you can just take the card out of your computer or your card reader, whatever, and then put it into the Raspberry Pi. When you have the Pi booted up, you can go to your internet networks, and it might take a while, but there's going to be port 500. No, there's going to be a network that says LoisLab Pi something.
Yep.
So you can find, well, it's 13?
Yep.
This is LoisLab Pi 13. Might be different for you.
If it asks you for a password, it's LoisLab.
Yeah. Okay, so you go to 192.168.4.1:8000. It already showed up there because I've done this multiple times. And it'll hopefully open that Cloud9 window. It will probably, before that, maybe ask for a password or username and password. That will just be LoisLab for the username and also LoisLab for the password. No capitals, no spaces.
Yep, great.
If that happens.
Yep.
It'll be like this. It's going to take a bit to load.
So next we want to go get the sample code from GitHub.
So put like a link in the description to the repo.
But it's going to be github.com/LoisLab.
Yep.
And so once you get to the LoisLab GitHub, there'll be in our repos. There's a link to the RC hack repo.
So you go to clone or download, clone with HTTPS. Whatever, just copy that link. Then you want to do git clone.
There you go.
And then the URL. Enter. Clone RC hack. And then I'll have RC hack right here. And you can have a file. And then there, I'm just going to pick up the car real quick.
Mm-hmm.
If I hit run. I'll do a little test wheel thing.
Okay. So you want to throw this down on the floor and show what it looks like?
Yeah.
Cool.
So now you know everything you need to know to build one of these. If you build one, which you should, like tweet at us at LoisLabNH, post in the comments or whatever, saying how it went.
Yeah, we'd love to hear from you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.